Thank you all for coming. It is really a special night for me to have all of you there, and for Sarah. I could spend the whole time recognizing my 5 disruptive classmates in front of me and all the other people here, but then you wouldn't hear anything about the rest of the story. I would like to talk about 2 people. From Washington, D.C. is Jeff Carneal. Jeff Carneal was the literary agent, not only for this book, but for our last book, Fisherman's Tomb, and he was instrumental in the publication of my first book, Unfit for Command. Jeff, I think it's fair to say that we've raised hell all over the United States. Jeff has caused all sorts of trouble. The Democrats still haven't forgotten the first book, unfortunately, and the Vatican, at least a few people there, weren't that enthusiastic about the second book. And Jeff, I think having created all that trouble, what do you say we take on the 2 most evil and powerful men on earth tonight with this list book and see how it goes? There you go. The other person I'd like to recognize is my wonderful stepdaughter, Amy Kurger. Amy Kurger has had some health challenges, and of all the people in the world, the one who most reminds me of Pavlova, whom I fell in love with in the course of this book, is Amy. Amy's not only short like Pavlova, and she not only dances well like Pavlova, but she's got a great, brave heart and a free spirit, exactly like Pavlova. So thank you for being here, Amy. Of course, the question is, why did we write the book to start off with? And instrumental to me in writing the book, my dad, my grandfather, talked about how in the 1930s they had read Mein Kampf and they knew how terrible a person Adolf Hitler was and Tojo, and they tried to tell people and no one listened. They lost an uncle of mine in World War II. The Navy lost much of the Pacific Fleet. Millions of people were killed in Hitler's horrible concentration camps just because people didn't listen. I did a lot of study, and I think we have 2 really bad people loose in the world, Vladimir Putin and Xi. And so the purpose of the book, in part, is to tell people about these 2 guys. They have the ideology, and their spiritual father is Joseph Stalin. So the book tells the story also of Joseph Stalin. In addition, it tells the story of what Stalin began, and that is large-scale bioweapons. Stalin began by Litter-Noi killings. He would kill individuals with things like anthrax. If you give someone anthrax, it looks like pneumonia. And then he used potassium and used curare to stop people's hearts. And so they'd say, hey, there's John O'Neill, he just didn't jog enough and had a heart attack after somebody gave me a dose of curare. He moved from individual Litter-Noi killings to huge bioweapons projects. The first of these was at a place called Saratov, and we'll talk about it a little bit. And so his idea was start with deniable killings of individuals and then have deniable killings of entire nations. His bioweapons projects spread in and survived him and spread into Soviet Russia, where they became Project Enzyme, a bigger project than nuclear weapons. And from Soviet Russia, they spread into China, and so that China has 14 huge bioweapons plants. We've just seen a leak from one of them, a COVID leak. That was the 5th major leak killing thousands of people out of these plants over the last 75 years. The first was at Saratov in 1939. We'll take a look at it in just a little while. Given all the evil that we're going to describe, the one thing I don't want to do is forget the good. And the great good here are the people that Stalin and Putin and Xi targeted. There's a reason why you deniably kill someone. You deniably kill someone because they won't bend, they won't break, and they're so noble that you can't afford to simply disappear them or kill them openly. And so when you study the people they killed, you're really looking at the stars that, as Gandhi once said, lead us to a far horizon. Why don't we, Sarah, start with the very first of these. This is a family. This is the Predisenza family. Nice, happy family of Russians. They left Russia and went to Spain because they didn't approve of Putin. And 2 weeks ago, that family was found with the husband hanged and the wife and child chopped to death with an axe. There were no fingerprints on the axe or the knife used to kill the husband and wife, nor was there any suicide note. And the conclusion of the Russian police was, well, it was obviously a suicide murder. It was the 7th suicide by a Russian oligarch in the past 4 weeks since Putin's invasion began. These are what are called Litter-Noy killings. In terms of the bio-war projects, we've all seen it. This audience would have at least 4 or 5 more of my friends in it if it hadn't been for COVID-19. And we've seen COVID-19 now kill 10 million people, over 1 million more people than the United States lost in all of its wars. Having said that, let's move on to the first of these as an example of what we're talking about, the most noble of all dancers, Anna Pavlova. This is Anna Pavlova's signature dance. It's called The Dying Swan. It's the most famous of all short dances in ballet. It depicts a swan in the last moments of life. A Greek tradition was that a swan, as it was dying, would be able to talk for the very first time. And its struggle for life represented the line between life and death. And so what Pavlova is doing is depicting, actually to some people, the tragedy of death, and to others, the joy of resurrection, depending on what you believe. It was first devised in 1905. It made her famous all over the world. She danced it more than 4,000 times, and it's repeated over and over again. Based on that, and a lot of other stuff we'll discuss, she became the most famous ballerina in the entire world. She went all over the world, as we'll discuss, but in 1927, she was summoned back to the Soviet Union by Stalin. She refused to go. He declared her an enemy of the Soviet people, and that produced outrage all over the world. He confiscated her estate. He told Soviet diplomats to try and block her dancing wherever she danced. They laughed at her, the countries, and her friends, worried about her, tried to get her to go to Hollywood to make another movie. The first movie she made was picked as the greatest one-time performance in history by an actress by New Yorker magazine about 3 years ago. She wouldn't go back. Instead, she kept dancing in Europe, and she planned to go right to the border of Stalin's empire, to go right into Poland in 1931. At the Ritz Hotel, she stayed at the Ritz. She told her friends that she felt a sword of Damocles coming down on her to kill her. She asked her friends to pray for her. At the Ritz Hotel, she ordered, in January of 1931, she ordered lunch in a room. It was brought to her room. She left her room, and she climbed on a train to The Hague. On the train to The Hague, she said, "I've been poisoned in Paris." She then began slowly, her lungs began to fill with water, and slowly over the course of a day, she died. Before her death, she summoned her friends in. She asked them to bring her swan costume that she had danced in so many times. She swore them to go forward the very next night with the scheduled performance in front of the King, Queen of England, and the King, Queen of Belgium. And then she made the sign of the cross, and she died. The very next night, the show went on, and her little company went forward in front of the King, Queen of England, the King, Queen of Belgium, and it came time for that dance to be performed. They announced that there was no understudy, no one would perform the dance because there was no one in the world that could dance like Pavlova, dance that. And so instead of doing that, they simply played the music that you've heard and slowly took a light and shined it on the stage in the places that she would have danced. Her death was news all over the world. This is actually the funeral. Her funeral had over 100,000 people in London that came to the Russian Orthodox Church. It was noted everywhere in the world except in the Soviet Union. In Soviet Russia, there was no notice at all that she had died. And so Pavlova sort of slowly passed into history. There were statues of Pavlova all over the world. This is one of them. This is a statue on top of the palace Theater in London, still there, blown up by the Germans in World War II and then reconstructed. There are still statues just like that. You all have seen the jewelry box that little girls have with the ballerina on top of the jewelry box. That's from Anna Pavlova. We'll go the dip that people do, that was Anna Pavlova. I should also say that when Anna Pavlova was killed on that very tour in late 1931, she was supposed to come again here to Houston, where she had danced in 1917. As I said, they built statues. Her friends in Hollywood went a little further. They mourned her, and so they all got together and they made a movie. The name of that movie was Grand Hotel. They all declined to be nominated for any individual Academy Awards, but that movie was picked as the best movie of 1932. It won the Oscar. And the lines of Greta Garbo in that movie have always been picked as one of the great 5 lines that have ever been delivered in a movie.
No, I haven't found her. Who's dancing? The plane? Oh, well, how was it? Good. All right, you keep the show going. This little trick is going to cost Madame a suit for breach of contract.
Let me see. No.
How about minors? Who is she? Where does she think she is? Russia? Where?
I want to be alone.
Where have you been? I suppose I can cancel the Vienna contract.
I just want to be alone.
You're going to be very much alone, my dear madame. This is the end.
That's called Garbo Speaks, always picked as among the, and the death of Anna Pavlova, the death of the Russian ballerina in that movie was left a mystery, and the death of Anna Pavlova was a mystery until some of the evidence you're just about to see. By the way, forgive our speaker system. The speaker system generally isn't working, so we jury-rig this up as best as we can. If you can't hear us, please raise your hand. At the very same time that Anna Pavlova was dying in January of 1931, this church, it was called the Church of Christ the Savior. It was the largest church in the entire Russian Orthodox and Greek Orthodox world. It was a duplicate of a great church called the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. You can see it right out of Stalin's window. Yeah, the window in the Palace of Amusement that he actually had an office in, and that was the problem. And so in January of 1931, he dynamited that entire church and blew it up. He tried to build what was called the Palace of the Soviets in that location, but in a parable, as you'll soon learn a little later, it kept collapsing. The sand made it collapse. And what in the end happened, and I'm getting ahead of my story, is in 1990, that church was exactly duplicated after the fall of the Soviet Union, and that's where it stands right now, surviving Stalin and surviving the Soviet Union. In any event, Pavlova, back to who and what she was, Pavlova was a little tiny woman, about 5'1" or 5'2", when she showed up at the Imperial Ballet in St. Petersburg, at the Mariinsky Theater in 1900. It was run by a man called Marius Petita. Petita was the grand old man of ballet. He's the guy that choreographed Swan Lake. He's the guy that choreographed the Nutcracker, Dance of the Pharaoh's Daughter, and most of the great ballets you've heard about, they were choreographed by Petita. He had come out of France in the 1840s, so he was very old by this time. In France in the 1840s had romantic ballet. The ballerinas were not necessarily great athletes, but they could convey great emotion. And Petita had formed a fabulous ballet, and the center of ballet in the world had moved to Russia. But he didn't particularly like some of his ballerinas whom he considered haughty. As he described it in his diary, in 1900, this little girl walked in. She was about 16 years old, but all of a sudden you could see her soul when she danced. He said that he fell in love with her. She was the dream of every ancient ballet master to see such a person. And so he as the whole world ultimately did, almost adopted her. And in the beginning, she kept trying to do all the great athletic moves that great ballerinas could do, and she didn't do them very well. She fell one time into an orchestra. And he kept telling her, your weakness is your strength. Your weakness is your strength. Because you see, anybody that saw Pavlova was always sort of rooting for her because you could see her soul in the way she danced. And it was really a great soul. And so she captured an entire audience like magic. She finally became very, very famous in Russia during the Imperial Ball of 1903. This is the costume she wore. The Great Imperial Ball of 1903 was the last great party, if we can call it that, in Russia. The Romanovs held a winter ball every year, and the very last one was in 1903. Her costume was done by Fabergé, the great jeweler, and all the costumes. They've been duplicated many times. And what she did as a little kid, still a little kid, she danced Swan Lake, and she danced other extracts, and people in Russia fell in love with her, even though she wasn't at that point even a grand ballerina. She continued with the Imperial Ballet. She became their greatest dancer by 1907, 1908. In 1910, she went to Paris with the Ballet Russe, run by a very different man, also described in the book, and also a genius named Diaghilev, and also, in Diaghilev's case, likely murdered also by Stalin. In any event, she fell out with Diaghilev, and in 1911, she formed her own little ballet company, and she began to tour. When she went to Bombay, they said she wasn't the greatest dancer in the world because she couldn't possibly be of this world. And in Paris, they said, if you didn't believe people had a soul, you never had seen Pavlova dance. She went back to Russia in 1914. The Tsar said, look, I've never seen you dance the Dying Swan. She said, I promise you I will come back to the Miranovsky and dance the Dying Swan for you. Wasn't to be that way. World War I came. She was outside of Russia. The Bolsheviks took over. The Romanovs were all executed in a basement and their bodies burned. And she was outside of Russia. And now, Sarah, tell them how the swan flied.
Well, here's the swan dancing with an elephant. She traveled all over the world. She said her prayer was her dance, and her mission was to seed the world with ballet. And she did that. She traveled to 44 different countries, and it's estimated she traveled over 400,000 miles, introducing classical ballet to 44 countries, which is a remarkable number when you think about that was before the days of air travel. She would also dance in a range of venues. She wasn't limited to the Met in New York or the Royal Opera House in London, both of which she danced. But she also famously danced in a mouse-infested theater in Jackson, Mississippi. And one time someone said, why do you go to these marginal, out-of-the-way theaters? And she said, if I don't go there, how will they ever see me dance? Which I thought was kind of funny and very confident. But she did travel. In World War I, she spent most of the time in North and South America. She began the decade of the 20s at her home called Ivy House in London. And then in 1922 began the first of 2 tours of Japan, China, the Philippines, and Africa. She then went to Australia, New Zealand, came back to North and South America, went to Asia, and then the Middle East and Europe. So she did travel quite a bit. Through her bravery, as you'll see in some of the places she danced, and her imagination, she really became the ultimate symbol of artistic freedom. And that's something that Stalin just couldn't stand. It's one reason he had to unfortunately poison her. Here she is with a camel. She had some good poses. Here she is in Bombay, India. She actually was very instrumental in changing Indian dance, developing Indian dance. Here's a reenactment of her dancing in Mexico. Perhaps her greatest dance of her life was in Mexico City in 1919. It was a very dangerous time. Mexico City was in turmoil. Madera, who had fought for independence and democracy, had just been killed by Huerta, who had then been taken over. And actually right before she arrived, Zapata, the revolutionary, had been killed. And the American Council even said, we highly advise you don't go. It's too dangerous for you to dance there. And she thought it was more important to introduce classical ballet to Mexico. So she went with 44 of her members of her company. and 200 armed guards on top of their train cars. When she arrived, she was given the Plaza del Toros to dance, the bull ring, and she danced in front of 32,000 people that night with Pablo Casals, the famous cellist, performing with her. At the end of the dance, she had choreographed the Mexican hat dance, which had been looked down upon by the upper classes, but she choreographed it beautifully, and to this day it's still the national dance of Mexico, thanks to Pavlova.
This man is Luncharski. Luncharski was the minister of culture of the Soviet Union. In 1927, he arrived with an invitation, a personal invitation from Joseph Stalin to return to Russia. It was an invitation that you couldn't refuse. When Diaghilev and Pavlova declined that invitation, Diaghilev's entire family vanished in Russia and were never found again. Pavlova's mother, who had come to try and get her to come back to Russia, also vanished. And Luncharski published an article accusing Pavlova of being an enemy of the Soviet people. Her foundation was seized in 1929. Alexandra Kollontai, likely Stalin's mistress, went to country after country in 1930 trying to get them not to allow Pavlova to dance there. And here's why. This is Joseph Stalin. That's Stalin when he was a young guy. Stalin, when he started, was, he actually went to the seminary, amazingly. And then he dropped out of the seminary, and he was sort of a Georgian bandit. And then he became a Marxist, but he was also a police informer at the very same time. He was a master of using stealth and using dishonest tactics to advance. Around 1905, he attached himself to Vladimir Lenin. He may well have poisoned Lenin's secretary later on. And he slowly seized power in the Soviet Union. By 1925, he was pretty absolute ruler of the Soviet Union. He was infatuated with ballet. He actually had a box at the Bolshoi. He killed several ballerinas. He killed directors. One of them put on some of the great Petita plays. He was sent to an insane asylum and then died a year later. It was either like thumbs up or thumbs down in the Coliseum with Stalin watching it in ballet. And so he hated the idea of these two people, and in particular Pavlova, dancing free. He had crude, silly ballets because he couldn't have the great Russian ballets. And so the whole attention of the world was on her. And so she became a tremendous target for him. In order to do what he was doing, he developed a number of tools. This is one of the most horrible buildings in the entire world. It's called the Lubyanka. It was the head of the KGB. More than 500,000 human beings were shot in the back of the head in that building. They're still finding cemeteries with as many as 400,000 anonymous deaths close to Moscow of people killed in the building. Near the building, he built something called Laboratory 1. As I told you, he conceived of Litternoi killings that look like a natural death. Maybe they were staged as a suicide, maybe they were staged as pneumonia. Walter Kravitsky, the KGB agent who did many of these, said, quote, any fool can murder someone. It takes a true artist to stage a natural death, like a death from pneumonia or a death from heart disease. This is the guy that headed the Lubyanka. He was nicknamed the Poison Dwarf, Yezhov. He was a guy described as being so evil that when he was a little boy, according to one of Stalin's friends, he must have been the kind of person that pulled wings off of flies just for amusement. He enjoyed watching people slowly die. That's the long and short of it. That's who he was. They had an entire group of executioners. This is one called Yasha. Putin recently, in 2017, named Yasha as the greatest of all Soviet foreign agents. He was a poisoner in Paris. He operated a ring in Paris called the Yasha Gang, which operated in the Ritz Hotel in Paris, France. In the group, and I put this guy in because of a friend of mine, Scott Atlas. Scott Atlas's dad, early in his career, was assigned representing some guy that had shown up at the border in McAllen. his name was Mr. Smith or Mr. Jones, but it wasn't Mr. Smith or Mr. Jones. It was Rudolf Ivanovich Abel, an atomic spy, as Scott's dad only learned in later years. He actually first started in the Yasha gang. And he said that Yasha, he was a radio operator for the Yasha gang in Paris and at the Ritz. And he said that Yasha was his inspiration in life. He was the guy that you may have seen the movie, who was exchanged for the pilot Powers. This is another one of the killers, and the most horrible of them maybe, Sergei Spiegelglass, the most famous Litternoy killer in the entire world. He staged natural deaths all over Europe. If you had to pick one person who was probably the one who put Anna Pavlova in contact with anthrax on that dinner tray in the Ritz, it was Sergei Spiegelglass. Blodkin was kind of the force guy. Blodkin's job was to actually execute people in brutal assassinations. He is estimated to himself shot over 100,000 people, executed them in the Ljubljana in his bloody career. This is Stalin's mistress, Kollontai. That's the woman who went around Europe as a diplomat trying to get people not to allow Pavlova to dance. And then, of course, we moved to sort of the swan song. Pavlova's swan song. Pavlova, as I've indicated, died mysteriously. You have to look at the book. There's a huge amount of evidence that Pavlova was poisoned with anthrax that created her deal. She was poisoned at the instance of Stalin and by the Yasha gang in Paris. The executioners that executed her in turn vanished. They were all executed by Stalin in the 1930s. Yezhov, you can see in the top picture, the poison dwarf. Well, what they would simply do is eliminate their pictures. So after 1938, you could find the same picture, but all of a sudden, Yezhov just wasn't in the picture anymore. Likewise, they executed every single one of the executioners. Now, moving from the executioners, I'd like to cover some more of the victims just very quickly. This is Gorky. Gorky was probably Russia's greatest novelist. He came back to Russia, and Stalin discovered his diary. And in his diary, he said, Stalin is a flea magnified by tyranny and by news into a fearsome creature. And so Gorky suddenly had pneumonia, as did his son, simultaneous pneumonia. They both died. Stalin gave his eulogy and named a city, Gorky, in the Soviet Union after him. This is the saddest of all. This is Raoul Wallenberg. Raoul Wallenberg was a Swedish diplomat. He saved over 100,000 Jewish citizens of Budapest from Eichmann, who was trying to transport them to Auschwitz by giving them Swedish passports. He was captured by the Soviets at the very end of World War II, and no one knew what had happened to him. And so in 1983, he was made an honorary citizen of the United States. This is Ronald Reagan speaking briefly about him.
Today, or herefore, I am signing a bill to make Raoul Wallenberg an honorary citizen of the United States. But in making him a United States citizen, I think we're the ones that are being honored. Raoul Wallenberg is the Swedish savior of almost 100,000 Jewish men, women, and children. What he did, what he accomplished, was of biblical proportions. Sir Winston Churchill, another man of force and fortitude, is the only other person who has received honorary United States citizenship. And as John F. Kennedy said at that signing ceremony, indifferent himself to danger, he wept over the sorrows of others. That companion.
In Israel, at the Holocaust Museum, there were over 10,000 trees planted to honor Wallenberg, commemorating some of the people he saved. And in this speech, which because of the bad acoustics we won't deliver, Reagan goes on to say, I promise you, to the Wallenbergs, I promise you that we will bring Raoul home. What Reagan didn't know is that Raoul Wallenberg had been used as a test rat in Laboratory 1, the poison lab, in 1947. He was literally used to test a poison called C4, and he died in excruciating pain. His body was then cremated, and his fate was hidden until the 1990s. And even today, Putin's Russia hides many of the records relating to Wallenberg. That's the guy, Stalin, whose face is now on the side of buses in Russia. Finally, we have Stalin's Dasha. And life circles around sometimes with good purpose. And in 1953, Stalin was planning another purge of Beria, of Khrushchev, of Molotov, probably anticipatory to launching a nuclear war on the world, sort of reminding us of some of the threats of today. And what happened is Beria poisoned Stalin with warfarin, rat poison. And so Stalin, and the evidence is in the book and now conceded by everybody, Stalin actually bled to death out of his stomach, and Beria, nice guy that he was, brought doctors in who applied leeches to Stalin. In Stalin's last minutes, he became conscious and he began waving his arms, screaming, and so on. His daughter said that she believed he saw the angel of death coming to get him. And so he died the very same way he had killed so many other people. Before we leave that Dasha, that's exactly the building that Putin uses today as an office. Sometimes the office is the message, and he uses Stalin's Dasha. Putin's grandfather was a cook, Stalin's cook. His father was an exterminator in the KGB. So we move now. After Stalin's death, he was put in a tomb with Lenin until which is ironic. You can see in the book an awful lot of evidence that Stalin himself poisoned Lenin. Stalin was certainly poisoned, and Beria would be standing on top of both of them giving speeches until Beria in turn was executed. In 1961, Stalin's body was taken out of the tomb after the extent of some of his crimes became known, and he was buried in the earth. And you know what day it was? It was Halloween night of 1961. There is a strange, symmetry to life. With Stalin's death, not everything died. He had started huge bioweapons programs. This is the Hotel Nacional in Moscow. In 1939, Stalin had begun a deal to weaponize plague and also to weaponize anthrax. And in 1939, he summoned, and this took a brave Russian to let us know about it. In 1939, he summoned the head of that project, a man named Abram Berlin, to come into Moscow to meet with him. Well, Berlin went to the Hotel Nacional, and he began coughing. They bring a doctor, and the doctor looks at him. He says, Abram, you've got pneumonic plague. We haven't seen pneumonic plague in Russia in 300 years. And this guy was weaponizing pneumonic plague. He got within 3 hours of giving it to the entire leadership of the Soviet Union. That was in 1939. The account is told now in some Soviet literature in a much more gentle way than and much less truthful way than I've just told the actual story. Saratov is still in use today, and it's still producing biological weapons for Putin. This is Putin, when he came to power, reinstituted and restarted all the poison deals. This is the president of the Ukraine, Yushchenko. Yushchenko was poisoned by Putin with dioxin in 2004. This is Litvenko. Litvenko was a Soviet dissident who went to London, and Litvenko was poisoned with yet another poison. Litvenko's final words, Litvenko said, well, you have poisoned me and taken away one life, but for the rest of your life, you'll always be known as Vlad the Poisoner. And they asked Putin what he thought about it, and he said, Litvenko is not Lazarus. He will not be coming back. This is the family that really resulted in everybody learning what Putin was all involved in. This is the Skripal family. Skripal was a defector. His daughter went to see him in England. She was followed, unknowing to her, and then there were efforts made to kill both she and her father with a Novichok, which is a Soviet Army nerve agent. Astoundingly, they survived, but other people died from the Novichok they left around. These guys weren't particularly clever, and so they were captured on cameras. And a blogger actually found these guys on Facebook. That's actually how they were tracked down. And there they are, unit, what is it,
29155.
29155. And they were congratulating each other on Facebook. The British Secret Service then tracked them back through their passports and fake names. They killed over 14 people in London, in England itself, that were tracked. There's no estimate of how many people they've killed. They're the assassin unit for Putin in the world, or they were until they idiotically revealed who they were. Of course, the latest poison victims are the oligarchs that are all committing suicide. This is Navalny. Navalny was the primary opposition to Putin in Russia. He was poisoned with Novichok. He left and got treatment in Germany, and then he was imprisoned for leaving Russia for 2 years to get treatment. And he's recently been sentenced to another 17 years, so effectively he's been sentenced to death in Russia. Putin continues with huge bioweapons facilities. He describes them as special warfare. He says you can avoid nuclear warfare. You can have someone, in effect, cough in Kansas, and then you say, gee, it's a shame you guys just didn't get vaccinated. And he's got a whole array of agricultural weapons, too. This is a party that we had a long time ago. I represented China in what seems like a different age. Back in the 1980s, the State Department sent me to them. I represented them and became very good friends with people in the Chinese oil ministry. There are many funny stories. There are at least 3 people here that were at that party that night. We bought them all cowboy hats and so on. After that, the world changed. One of those guys at that party died at Tiananmen Square. What happened is the Chinese hardliners in China deposed the premier of China. They deposed the head of the Communist Party. They slaughtered maybe 8,000 students and others in Tiananmen Square. That's Tank Man. He just ran out in front of the tanks. Tank Man has disappeared. No one ever knows what's happened to him. And ever since then, China has moved harder and harder and harder, disguising it with a smile, but definitely becoming more and more hardline. The worst of these is Xi, who took over in China in 2013. He poses as a new Mao. There's a typical Xi pose. He's killed any number of people. Xi has said that if you don't believe in Stalin, you can't be a communist. And so all of a sudden, people began to simply disappear in China. This is Meng. Meng was the head of Interpol. He was probably the most incorrigible policeman in the world. They tried to get him to do things at Interpol for China. He wouldn't. He disappeared in China, was tried, had a supposed confession, and now has disappeared into the Gulag. This is the minister, one of the most famous ministers in the world, Wang Yi, at the Early Rain Church, who visited Bush at the White House. He is in prison with his wife for 11 years for being a Christian. The at least 72 members of his congregation have simply disappeared off the face of the earth. The speculation is that they've all been killed. This is China's greatest movie star, Fan Bingbing. Fan Bingbing acted in American movies. The dress she's wearing is called the Three Vases. It's based on 3 vases, the most famous porcelain in history from the Ming era. Fan Bingbing basically played too many empresses and not enough workers, and so Fan Bingbing is in house arrest, largely disappeared.
Your Majesties, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the Norwegian Nobel Committee has decided to award the Nobel Peace Prize for 2010 to Liu Xiaobo for his long and non-violent struggle for fundamental rights in China. The Norwegian Nobel Committee has long believed that there is a close connection between human rights and peace. Such rights are a prerequisite for the fraternity between nations of which Alfred Nobel wrote in his will. This was the first paragraph of the committee's announcement on the 8th of October this year. We regret that the laureate is not present. He is in isolation in a prison in northeast China. Nor can the laureate's wife, Liu Xia, or his closest relatives be with us. No medal or diploma will therefore be presented here today. This fact alone shows that the award was necessary and appropriate. We congratulate Liu Xiaobo with this year's Peace Prize.
He was imprisoned. There was a statement that he gave his wife to be read. They wouldn't let him read it at the trial. The statement is notable because he said he loves all of his jailers. He loves the judge that's sentencing him, and he just prays for the day that China will once again be free. And he says to his wife, your love is like sunshine that breaks on the bars of my prison. He was denied any medical care. This picture was smuggled out of China. He was China's very first indigenous Nobel Prize winner. In Wuhan, China, in December of 2019, the location of one of the largest military biolabs on Earth, as well as a normal virology lab, a doctor named Dr. Li discovered a patient, and the patient seemed to have a completely new virus. So he went on the internet and he said, "We have a new virus appearing here." He was immediately arrested and he was charged with releasing state secrets. Although he was only 35 years old, the Chinese claimed he died of COVID-19. That was the bug that he had. He saw early cases of. The death rate for somebody 35 years old from COVID-19 is less than 1.5%. Not only did he die, but the other early doctors died. All the early records of the transmission of the disease were all destroyed on orders of the Chinese government. They moved in exactly the same military unit that killed all those students back at Tiananmen Square. They arrested any number of reporters. From China, this virologist escaped and said she had been involved in the actual alteration of viruses for the Chinese using CRISPR tools and other tools. There's the Wuhan lab. The COVID virus appeared right in Wuhan. The COVID virus is a combination of a virus from a horseshoe bat in a cave located 1,100 miles from Wuhan and 4% that somebody added in. It has never been found naturally anywhere in the world. The bat virus exists only in that cave, and the normal range of the bat is 20 miles. This is John Daly dealing with the simple fact.
You mean like so perhaps there's a chance that this was created in a lab, there's an investigation?
A chance?
Well,
oh my God.
There's evidence I'd love to hear.
There's a novel respiratory coronavirus overtaking Wuhan, China. What do we do? Oh, you know who we could ask? The Wuhan Novel Respiratory Coronavirus Lab. The disease is the same name as the lab. That's just a little too weird, don't you think? And then they ask those scientists, they're like, how did this, so wait a minute, you work at the Wuhan Respiratory Coronavirus Lab. How did this happen? And they're like, a pangolin kissed a turtle. And you're like, no.
Well, in fact, there's a sort of a bar diagram. 96.2% of the virus comes from a horseshoe bat 1,100 miles away in the Himalayas that was brought to Wuhan into the Wuhan lab in 2015. We know that from an article that they proudly published. We know that they were doing enhancement experiments. Understand that in China, the biolabs have a shadow military and communist presence in each biolab. And in terms of the Wuhan lab, they have a very large military biolab. Its job is not to find vaccines. Its job is to weaponize viruses. This is a piece of information that we got from folks in China that has been largely suppressed in the United States. This is a doctor who was the greatest, really the greatest virologist in China, died in 1995. In 1977, a virus appeared in the world, and people were shocked by this. I remember this because I got the flu virus. It was exactly the same as the 1955 virus. This is like my friend Scott Atlas in 1977 being exactly the same as Scott Atlas of 2022. It just doesn't happen. Viruses mutate. And so everybody said, hey, somebody's been preserving this virus that got out. And the Chinese said, not us. We don't know anything about it. Well, the truth came out in 1994 through this doctor. And he said, the 1977 flu, oh, I know about that. We're developing a vaccine for the 1955 virus, which we had preserved, using our military troops, and somehow it escaped. Now think about that for just a second. Why do you develop a vaccine for a virus that exists nowhere in the world except in your own labs? Why do you use your military troops to do that? And then, of course, why do you lie about it? And that's very likely what happened with COVID-19. COVID-19 was almost certainly a novel virus. It's never been located in the wild. It was being manufactured. It was inadvertently released, probably during vaccine tests. It has killed so far 11 million people and over 1 million people in the United States, including some really wonderful people here. We talked about that cathedral in Moscow, and it's rebuilt exactly as it was beforehand. I promised a friend of mine from Moscow that if I ever wrote this book, that I would always tell the story of Anna Akhmatova. Anna Akhmatova was the greatest of all Russian poets. She's called the poet of love. She was loved by Modigliani before he became a famous painter, and he painted her over and over and over again. It seems like she was the only one he would paint. And when World War I came, she went back to Russia, and when Stalin took power, she wouldn't leave. She detested the Bolsheviks, and she was a free spirit. She was also very religious. The Bolsheviks said that she was half harlot and half nun. That was their way of dismissing her, but they couldn't execute her because she was simply too famous or for some other reason. So instead of executing her, they simply made her a non-person. They executed her husband, they executed her son, they executed everyone that knew her, and if you helped her, you went to prison and disappeared into the gulag. Her poems were all destroyed. The books with the poems in them were destroyed. And if she tried to write a poem, the KGB seized the book and took it. And so all she could do was write poems on her own heart, sort of like Homer did, and remember them for another better time. And that's exactly what she did. One of her greatest poems is about Kresge Prison, when she sat giving bundles of food to people who were being sent to Siberia. And an old lady recognized her and said, Anna, will you tell people someday about this? And she said, I will. And so after Stalin left, and in the later years, they wanted to do a statue of Anna Akhmatova because I have to tell you, she translates well. She's like Keats. You could read her in English, and she's fabulous. And so she said, you can only do a statue of me in one place, overlooking Kresge Prison. Of course, that seemed to be impossible. In the Yeltsin years, here's what happened. There's her statue. They built it overlooking Kresge Prison. And it's just as she said, she wanted a statue made that way so that when the snow fell on the statue, her eyes would cry for the prisoners who died in Kresge Prison. And it's the place that the refuseniks actually go to in Russia. Putin closed Kresge Prison and moved it out of town because he was so embarrassed, although it's just as brutal as it always was. And they gathered there because they say that Putin, just like Stalin, is afraid of Akhmatova and her rosary and her presence. Sarah, why don't you tell them about the computer and tell them how the swan actually actually flies.
We did. We had lots of trouble publishing this book. Publishing houses didn't want, they wanted the book, but they didn't want us to talk about China and wanted us to take Putin out. And then we had some trouble of our own. Our computer system was hacked in the cloud. I noticed a website that I run totally separate from the book was getting hits from Wuhan and Shanghai, which was disturbing. And then when I began to work on the manuscript, I noticed it had been opened at 4 in the morning, and I was the only one that had access to the manuscript. John didn't even have it. And then a couple weeks later, I began to work on the manuscript, and all previous versions had been deleted. And so at that point, we contacted the FBI, who got us in touch with a forensic expert, computer expert, who was able to determine it was breached through the cloud, not my hard drive, from someone in China, and that was all that they could tell us at the time. But we want to end on hope. It's been kind of a dark presentation, but Pavlova left hope for us. If Stalin thought that he would write an end to Pavlova by killing her and selling all of her possessions and her foundation, he was mistaken. Little girls everywhere have been inspired by Pavlova, including Audrey Hepburn even. Here's a little girl in front of a 1911 famous painting. She introduced the Texas dip here in Houston, Texas. If any of you, I imagine many in the crowd, have been in dead balls and done this dreaded bow, we can thank Pavlova for that. But she also had 37 biographies written about her, a movie in Hollywood that made the Academy Awards. Sir Frederick Ashton made Fred Steps. Any dancers in the crowd will know what that's about. And so she did. She inspired people and continues to inspire people. Ray Bradbury was an author who wrote a book about a single ballerina disappearing, having the power to transform the future. And Pavlova proved to be Bradbury's butterfly. She actually even danced the butterfly many times, but she proved to be the swan or the butterfly that still inspires today. We found this video actually to end. These are ballerinas from around the world dancing the dying swan for COVID relief. And it's just wonderful to see that her dance still lives on today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We'd love to answer any questions you have. It's really, in the 1930s, my dad and my grandfather, they told me later, they tried so hard to tell people about Hitler and Tojo and nobody would listen. And God, they lost one brother and they lost a lot of people to these monsters because people wanted to pretend that they weren't what they were. And so we really wanted to give the world sort of a chance in our book. These are bad people. Sadly, I mean, I wish they were great, but they really aren't. And they have killed a lot of people, and they present a real threat to ourselves and our kids. And the beginning of it is knowing about it and knowing about their bioweapons and so on. We'd love it if you go on and give us great reviews on Amazon or buy the books on Amazon or get others to buy to get the story out. It really is an important story. And we have some people that don't want it to get out at all, for sure.